My name is Alexandria Pavlich, and I am a medical sociology graduate student at the University of Saskatchewan, working in a lab focused on One Health and Wellness. My specialization is in suicidology and chronic pain, where my current master's research, which is nearly completed, has been exploring the social benefits that psychiatric service dogs have for military veterans at high risk for suicide. I completed my undergraduate degree at York University in Toronto, Ontario, and today I'm going to be presenting my undergraduate honors thesis, which was a discourse analysis on the Government of Canada's National Suicide Prevention Framework. Just a quick content warning. As the title implies, this is a presentation on suicide. No methods or details will be mentioned about self-killing, but this is obviously a heavy topic that can be unsettling for many people. To begin, suicide is conceptualized as a phenomenon in need of public health intervention. Canada currently has no national suicide prevention strategy. Most existing approaches to suicide prevention cite that untreated mental illness is the most significant factor in suicidal ideation and behavior. This means that biomedical discourse is constantly privileged when approaching the topic. But to understand how we got to this fully medicalized perspective, we have to look at some history. Understandings of suicide used to be rooted in spiritual, religious, or criminological discourse. This is why we say we committed suicide, because it used to be a crime. One of the primary early explanations was that suicide was orchestrated by the devil. But in order to avoid the stigmatizing status associated with such a sinful act, laypersons began to plead that those who died by suicide were suffering from something called melancholia, which today is quite similar to depression. This more rationalistic approach took hold in the post-Enlightenment era and was a position adopted by medical professionals. So over time, biomedical discourse began to frame suicide as a chemical disequilibrium of the mind. With this context set, what I wanted to do for my thesis was critically analyze why this dominant biomedical view is still so prevalent and deeply ingrained in contemporary society. This is something I could attempt to do by unpacking specific text. Therefore, my research question asked, how can examining a Government of Canada document help us understand how suicide in Canada is perpetually reduced to a biomedical phenomenon in need of an exclusively public health approach? The reason that this inquiry is so perfect for sociology is because of the theoretical tools we have within our discipline. First, a social constructivist approach, so how claims to what is accepted as an essential or objective truth come to exist through a complex web of historical interactions and power dynamics. Second, my boy Foucault and his idea of discourse. So basically how organizing bodies of knowledge govern the way we think, speak, or act, which is done through the use of rules, regulations, and the study of text. This method that I used was a discourse analysis, which draws heavily from Dorothy Smith and her institutional ethnography methodology. This method of investigation addresses the context. I'm going to start that sentence again. This method of investigation of the content within a text to analyze basically how a social problem is spoken about and where the dominant discourse then helps us shape the solutions that are applied to the social problem under scrutiny. This method can reveal hidden patterns to allow us to reject the notion that power and bias are devoid in scientific rationality and truth-seeking. Some key concepts that are crucial to my overall argument. First is the concept of medicalization by Peter Conrad. This is when a problem or behavior is defined in medical terms, described using medical language, understood through the adoption of a medical framework, or treated with medical intervention. Also, the DSM-5, which is the medical handbook that drives all discursive knowledge and institutional procedures that are psychiatric in nature. This is basically the boss text, as Dorothy Smith would say, as it contains all the tools that are used to diagnose and treat so-called mental illness. All sorts of documents are produced from the DSM, information suicide manuals, mental health workshops, crisis line scripts, and basically any prevention strategy stems from the knowledge that exists in the DSM. However, it is really important to note here that Gary Greenberg is an investigative journalist who unpacked the scientific evidence behind the DSM in his 2013 work. His extensive interviews with mental health professionals and researchers illuminated how psychiatric labels are not, in fact, real illnesses, but socially constructed guidelines with limited validity and, in many cases, zero scientific evidence behind their claims. This is so troubling because mental illness is repeatedly cited as the leading cause of suicide. This is problematic because existing discourses like this then suggest that all suicide is preventable with psychiatric intervention. It forces individuals to conform to these biopsychiatric conceptualizations when seeking help, which may not line up with their own personal views, and it limits the individual's ability to feel that they can overcome suicidal ideation because of this disempowering illness origin label. It's become something that's seemingly totally out of their control. I wanted to investigate a text that referred to suicide but wasn't directly biomedical or something used by practitioners, so I turned to the gray literature and found the Guide for the Future Federal Prevention Framework in Canada. The government in Canada produced this document, and it heavily focuses upon bioscientific language and calls for a public health approach to suicide, erasing any other potential perspectives. For example, in the opening paragraph, it says, of the nearly 4,000 Canadians who die by suicide every year, more than 90% were living with mental illness. So the question I have is, where does this claim come from? The base supporting reference that is driving the document I analyzed is a single journal article published by BMC Psychiatry in 2014. This article has been cited over 600 times. The data from the article, however, came from psychological autopsies. This is a method in suicide research where information about the deceased is collected post-mortem by informants who knew the person who died. They speak to physicians, caregivers, spouses, friends. This form of data collection has been repeatedly criticized because there are major complexities with confounding variables. There are issues regarding unreliable information gathering from the informants, where there is an unlimited potential for bias, and there's also extreme bioscientific reductionism. A focus on psychiatric labels tied to the person who died perpetually outweighs the more important contextual factors affecting the individual at the time before their death. So if we're going to unpack the document a little bit further, the readers come to realize that all the at-risk populations for suicide are referenced relationally only to their mental illness label. Canadian Armed Forces, for example, which is where my suicide specialty focuses, indicate that this group has a higher prevalence of mood and anxiety disorders than the general population. Incarcerated individuals have an increased suicide risk because of a mental health problem or a diagnosed mental illness. Indigenous Canadians are repeatedly cited as having higher than average substance use and mental illness concerns. But what is missing here? What is missing is the social variables, the context under which people suffer, and the experiences of trauma exposure in their cases. Obviously, there's not enough time to go into every single little detail of my analysis, but I concluded 3 general discursive findings. The first one is that suicide is pathological, rooted in mental illness. Second, suicide should be understood as a phenomenon suitable exclusively for scientific inquiry. This is displayed through scientific methods in the way that they do their risk assessment. It's based in objective reasoning, descriptive statistics, self-surveillance activities. These very rational and scientific approaches trump all other understandings of suicide because, lastly, suicide is portrayed as an individual act devoid of structural considerations. This is driven by neoliberal ideas suggesting that any individual has the capacity to utilize medical intervention, and failure to do so is their own fault alone. The problem with this from a sociological standpoint is that the risk factors for suicide are medicalized and individualized private concerns. They are devoid of contextual or structural considerations. If you've taken any medical sociology class, you know that the power that the medical industrial complex has in our society is immense and far-reaching. So the findings within the document also assume that there is a shared system of meaning for why someone dies by suicide, and that shared system is objective and biological, with little consideration given to any experiential conditions that may be involved. As sociologists, we know that qualitative variables are constantly in flux and context dependent, so it simply can't be the case for suicide. The framework also fails to recognize the collective stance or structural and life chance factors that are root determinants of actual suicide risk. Culture, for example, whether that's in Indigenous populations, incarcerated or military contexts, this culture is never meaningfully considered or included in risk assessment models. So social histories are only briefly listed as a potential consideration to Indigenous populations only, and they base that around colonization, no consideration to the other at-risk groups. And trauma, when it is mentioned, is only done so in passing, and it's always at the very bottom of the etiology list. So we need to just take a step back for a second and realize that there are only two categories that can be derived from instances of every case of suicide. The first is that there is a moment of unregulated impulse control. This can often be attributed to substance use or mood disorders, if we want to look at it from a medicalized standpoint. And secondly, each individual that experiences suicidality had a propensity to intense psychological pain and suffering. But this doesn't need to be reflective of a physiological occurrence in the brain, but can be incurred directly by social circumstance, by things like social isolation and alienation. This two-part model here is common knowledge within critical suicide research, and it indicates that there is an exclusively social component where the 2 points listed are triggered by an environmental event and a social circumstance or position. Because we only have 15 to 20 minutes, this was just a brief overview of a much larger problem that speaks to the power that biopsychiatric actors have over our everyday life. I want to just give one example for consideration, given the escalating rates of suicide among our Indigenous communities in Canada. The majority of Indigenous communities make sense of their psychological pain as a result of ongoing social suffering because of historical oppressions and ongoing harms of colonization, not because of clinical or chemical conditions. So if suicide is conceptualized as having social origins in structural racism or cultural wounds, our medical professionals who have very limited education in this, where mention of trauma in their curriculum is basically non-existent, are they truly the best authority for providing interventions to alleviate social suffering? And should they be the primary stakeholders in providing solutions? I will let that sit with you for a minute. But in closing, my aim here today was to reveal how suicide has come to be a depoliticized form of social suffering. Suicide changed from previously being understood as a spiritual and social phenomenon to an exclusively biomedical and individual one. The knowledge provided within the Government of Canada document that I assessed forces readers to basically conclude that mental illness is the leading risk factor for suicide. Trauma is of minimal relevance, and when social risk factors are briefly mentioned, they are presented as private and personal concerns. For example, substance use is noted as a significant factor, but it's also treated as something only on an individual level without any structural considerations for why someone may have turned to substance use in the first place. This is absolutely a result of medicalization of the everyday life, which is driven by bioscientific discourse, which focuses on suicide as an objective, statistically measurable phenomenon, which simply cannot capture the complexity of the issue. If we are here today to reimagine social futures, I think that this topic is a key example where we must recognize that texts like the DSM, as well as the government document I analyzed, are prone to bias when they fail to incorporate insider knowledge of those with lived experience of suicide and extreme forms of social suffering. Prevention protocols must not perpetually privilege expert knowledge over much needed qualitative data that can be derived from suicide survivors, who are often the ones who are the most critical of exclusively medical responses to distress. That is all for today. You can feel free to contact me if you have questions about more of my suicide research at alexandriapavlich.com, or I'm also very active on Twitter at Pain Sociologist. Thank you so much.